Thank you. Well, that was much food for thought. Minister Shanmugam did send his apologies in advance that he wasn't able to join us live tonight, which is why it was pre-recorded. He's asked some interesting questions. Let me sort of quickly repeat some of these. One, should we view the Abraham Accords against the backdrop of efforts by the Gulf to diversify their economies and transform their societies? Is there room for cautious optimism? What could the Abraham Accords mean for Southeast Asia? I want to welcome our three panelists, Ambassador Eva Rotem, Professor Harsh Pant, and Dr. Martin Indik. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us, especially Dr. Indik. I know it's terribly early in the morning over there. We will run this panel having the three panelists speak one after the other. They have about 6 to 8 minutes. And after that, we will allocate the remaining sort of 30 minutes to time for questions and answers, which I will open up and see which of our speakers would be actually willing to take the question, or if all of them want to answer it, that's also fine by me. Let me quickly introduce our three panelists now so that I don't keep interrupting you all and we can move from one person to the next. Our first speaker will be Ambassador Yuval Rotem. He's a 35-year veteran of Israel's diplomatic corps and served as the Director General of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 2016 to 2020, overseeing all the body's diplomatic activities, foreign policy, and public diplomacy efforts. During his extensive diplomatic career, he has also served as a foreign policy advisor or chief of staff to different foreign ministers through his long career. So he comes to us with much experience, and I look forward to hearing from him. Our second speaker is Professor Harsh Pant. He's a professor of international relations with King's India Institute and is director, studies and head of the Strategic Studies program at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi, as well as director of the Delhi School of Transnational Affairs at Delhi University. His current research is focused on Asian security issues, and he writes regularly for various Indian and international media outlets, including the Japan Times, Wall Street Journal, The National, the Hindustan Times, and The Telegraph. Our final speaker is Dr. Martin S. Indik, who is a distinguished fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. He was previously the John C. Whitehead Distinguished Fellow in International Diplomacy in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institute, and from February 2015 to March 2018 served as Executive Vice President of Brookings. He also served as the US Special Envoy for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations from July 2013 to July 2014. He's the author of the recently released Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. And if you haven't read it, please read it. It's a very good book. Okay, let me now hand over to Ambassador Rotem to start the discussions. We will then move on to Professor Harsh and finally Dr. Indik. Ambassador Rotem.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you very much for inviting me to this conference, and welcome also to my panel, my colleagues in the panel. I will start with a few observations about Abraham Accords, and I guess that I will have some question answer later, so I'll be able to go further with this kind of story. I think that the most important thing is that, and I think that the minister has outlined a very important analysis of that. The main story, I think what we have seen is that this is a product of 20 years in making, in terms of many steps behind the scene, diplomatically, and others, that have cultivated the ground gradually to what we have seen in the summer of 2020. 40 years after the Islamic Revolution and well over 10 years after the Arab Spring, I think brought to many of the countries in our neighborhood to understand a few elements that are very much brought us into this, I would say, beginning of the transformation of the region. First of all, the fact that there has been more and more acknowledgement that the Arab-Israeli conflict is not the only conflict in the Middle East. The fault line I don't want to say have changed completely, but definitely when people have seen and understand that when someone is firing rockets from Yemen by the Houthi into Saudi Arabia, this has nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. Or when Libya is going to some degree of disintegration, this has nothing to do actually with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So the idea that you have more conflicts in the Middle East, I think it is to some extent the ability of other countries in the region to move forwards and realizing that Israel might be a partner, an ally, a friend, whatever you want to have this kind of definition, in what might be the future structure of the Middle East. With this respect, I have to say that the Israeli growing economy, Israeli success story technologically, when a country like Israel turned to be, I would say, 9.5 million people today with about $500 billion economy, I think gave a lot of confidence and to some extent ability to be more, to develop more nuance in the way we're doing and the way we're pursuing foreign policy. I think what we have seen since 2016 is basically an idea that suddenly we can be regarded as a medium-sized regional power to the extent that we can reach out beyond the conventional or traditional Israeli foreign policy. We start travel to Asia, to Latin America, to Africa. We were more sure of ourselves in the way we're pursuing, to some extent, our policies. That, of course, have been noticed by the countries around us. And above all, it's the story of Iran that for the many other countries in the region turned to be the key issue upon they basically define or formulate to some extent their own policy. And the idea that we saw eye to eye with the major Sunni countries in the region, what are the threats for stability in the region, for survivors of the regime in the region, brought us together to cooperate first behind the scene, but then, of course, culminating into the process of the Abraham Accords that brought us as of the summer 2020 into a very much different direction. I think that there is a room of optimism. I think that it's important to and I will spell it out very clearly, without an American involvement, without an American leadership in the region, none of this would be able to be accomplished. In the end of the day, there was always an American component in each and every one of those agreements. It's the same thing that took place in Egypt, with Egypt in the 70s, with the Jordan in the 90s, and with the Palestinians. So for all of us in the region, looking up to American leadership, to American involvement and engagement is critical if we want to see more steps and enlargement of the Abraham Accords. And there's a paradox here, in a way, because to some extent, these accords come to being because there was a growing perception that America has reduced interest in the Middle East. And nevertheless, without America, there is no deal like Abraham Accords. So we all need to understand this nuance that on one hand, America may want to pivot into other area, but America interests in the end, if they want to see more enlargement of the peace in terms of scope, in terms of size, we shall have to have an American engagement and involvement also in the future. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Okay, let's go on to Professor Harsh.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, the Middle East Institute, for having me as part of this very interesting conversation. I was Ambassador Rochan has made some very interesting points, and I think the minister previously also gave us a structure within which to think about some of these questions that this panel is supposed to answer. I'm looking at this primarily from the point of view of India and Asia, and the emerging discourse in the Indo-Pacific. Ambassador Rochan talked about America's desire to pivot away from Middle East to Indo-Pacific. I think that's in some ways that's quite palpable, and it is generating a set of, I think, choices for countries like India, perhaps even for China and in the region, and some very interesting developments, both in terms of where India's engagement in the region is moving in the Middle East, as well as some of the broader questions about India's foreign policy priorities over time, how they are changing and evolving in the broader context. I would like to posit some of those aspects. I think what a lot of the discussion, both by the minister and by Ambassador Rochan, also underscored, is that there are a whole host of challenges, both at the structural level as well as domestic, political, and economic level in the Middle East, that have attained a certain cutting edge in the last few years. And that means that for a country like India, that has had a very traditional approach to the region, there are possibilities of reimagining that role in the region. Some of that is because there is no other option, because there are structural changes, variables that are pushing India in a certain direction that can be. But also, I think the bottom-up changes that are pushing New Delhi into embracing certain countries more vigorously and more openly than before. And I think that I think in some ways is also the challenge and a unique dilemma for India. Now, at the structural level, of course, we have seen the shift, the rise of China and the Indo-Pacific. The rise of the Indo-Pacific. What is very interesting is that India's conception of the Indo-Pacific includes the Middle East. So it goes all the way from eastern shores of Africa to the last parts of the on the Pacific coast. So you have an entire maritime geography where India is looking at afresh its approach both to its eastern side as well as to its western neighborhood. And in that context, India's more vigorous pursuit of its interests with some of its Middle Eastern partners becomes a sine qua non. I think that is something that India has to engage with much more substantively. So you have China's rise of the Indo-Pacific, rise of India's own imagination, what kind of a role it wants to play in the Indo-Pacific. But also at the same time, something that was talked about earlier, there's this perception that America itself may be pivoting away. And while America remains, indispensable almost, as Ambassador Rochan was pointing out, it is also a question of the perception that perhaps America's equities lie somewhere else. And the long-term strategic challenge with China is sharpening, and therefore that challenge has to be encapsulated in certain geographies much more than in others. And I think that allowed the regional states also to come up with a regional response. And in some ways, the evolving regional realities also owe the present configuration to a large extent to what the regional states want. And in some ways, regional states have been the drivers in shaping the conversation, both whether you look at, of course, Abraham Accords would not have happened without American push, but also the fact that regional states could take on some of those challenges because they themselves are under pressure and look at the long-term strategic challenge of American priorities shifting perhaps, or to China becoming a more potent actor, or trying to find their own space in this geopolitical jostling that is happening across the globe, including in the Middle East. So I think what that does is that it gives India's traditional approach, it makes India's traditional approach to the Middle East somewhat difficult to defend from New Delhi's perspective. And therefore, the traditional approach of India was very simple, that we have three pillars in the Middle East. You have the Gulf states, Arab Gulf states, you have Israel, and you have Iran, and all three have to be equally quoted in some ways in equal measure, because there is that balancing act that India wanted to create in the region. And now it was always very clear, if you look at the equities that India has had in the region, that Israel and the Arab Gulf states both are much more important for India in terms of real material interests, whether it was trade, energy security, diaspora, remittances, technology, regional security. I mean, these were the actors with whom India was engaging much more substantively. But rhetorically, the idea was always that, look, the trifecta of Iran, Israel, and the Arab Gulf states have to be managed. And that had been the driving pivot in some ways, because Iran also plays a very important role in some of the key regional questions like Afghanistan for India. So therefore, whether it was trying to figure out an alternative route to Afghanistan via Chabahar port, or whether it was looking at India's role in Central Asia, Iran was seen as an important partner. Now, when you look at what has happened in the last few years, and what has happened in the way the regional security architecture has shaped up, new possibilities emerged for India, and I think Abraham Accords in some ways exemplified for India what was always very clear, or made it very clear for India what was always very evident, that look, the Arab Gulf states and Israel remain and are willing and able now to move beyond the older binaries and therefore the possibilities grew. And one of the very interesting developments in that regard has been this meeting last year, what is often termed as a Middle Eastern Quad, India, Israel, US, and UAE. A very interesting development in and of itself, but also I think exemplifying that India was now willing, or has now been willing, to come out of the older shadow of non-alignment in the region. This idea that it was, for a very long time during the Cold War, that the idea was that India should not be taking the lead from the US and trying to shape its own response, or at least trying to show to the world that it is moving away. And that it is not bound by the US, interests. I think what Quad tells you is an interesting approach that India is following on this quadrilateral dialogue that has just started. Tells you that India is willing now to enter into the space of what are called as minilaterals and plurilaterals, which which are being defined as the alliances of the future. That in some ways these ad hoc, flexible coalitions, which are more about issues, is something that India is very comfortable with. And officially, India has also declared that India no longer sees itself as non-aligned. It is willing to align with countries based on issues. So I think these issue-based coalitions, and one of the manifestations of that issue-based coalition has been in the Middle East in the form of this quadrilateral dialogue. Now, how far it goes, what it does, what kind of robust architecture it creates, that remains to be seen. But I think the fact that India was able to make that move, India was able to articulate its position on that, is itself in line with, I think, broader Indian thinking, which is moving away from a broader balancing role to a one where India looks at itself as a leading player, trying to shape global order, rather than being simply a recipient of global norms and structures being shaped by others. And I think that has been a very important feature. And I would just end there, because I think that lays out the broader contours of India's engagement in the region, both in the context of what has happened in the last few years, as well as in the context of broader structural and systemic shifts that the region has witnessed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's been quite interesting. I mean, we've had two different perspectives. Ambassador Rotan's was really from the perspective of Israel and being as part of that region. You have the Indian perspective, because I think with the geopolitics and with everything else that is happening, you can't ignore different players. And India has quite a long history with that part of the world, with the Gulf states and with Israel. Let me now turn the floor over to Dr. Inde. And then I do have some questions that I want to ask to get the discussions going, but I'm going to give the floor now to Dr. Inde.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to appear, even virtually, both with my fellow panelists and for the Middle East Institute So thank you for the invitation. The United States clearly, whether it's leaving the region and pivoting to Asia or staying, has a critical role to play. And we are seeing in real time an adjustment in that overall approach. And I think it's important to recognize that while the United States has sought to pivot away from the Middle East because of greater priorities in Asia with a rising China and in Europe with an aggressive Russia, there is a recognition now in Washington, in the Biden administration, that it's essential to find a way to have three priorities, even if the Middle East priority is, for the time being, somewhat of a lesser one. That if we turn our backs on the Middle East, then a whole range of bad things from the American perspective start to happen. And in particular, I think as we have sent out the message to our allies and partners in the region that we can't be relied upon, and not just because of the pivot to Asia, but because of the vagaries of our own domestic politics, they have started to hedge. And that hedging has brought stronger relations and greater involvement in the region by Russia and, of course, China. And so, as a kind of realization, perhaps slow, perhaps late, that we can't simply leave a vacuum in the region. There is now greater focus on how to walk and chew gum and also carry a stick at the same time. And as a consequence of that, since we can't do it all, we have to look to our regional partners and allies to step up as we step back. And that's the process that's going on at the moment. Interestingly, and Ambassador Rotem referred to this paradox as we leave or give the impression that we're leaving the region, our allies and partners step up and start behaving responsibly in a way that they didn't before, and take on more responsibilities. And nowhere is there a better manifestation of this than the Abraham Accords, which certainly focused on normalizing relations and making peace between Israel and UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and hopefully others. But that is driven by a strategic calculation on all of the members of the Abraham Accords, which is in the process turning it into an axis, the Abraham Accords axis. That strategic calculation, which long preceded the actual coming out ceremony on the White House lawn, was a concern about the way in which Iran was acting in the region to destabilize it. Iran maintaining its revolutionary dimensions, seeking to expand and achieve a kind of hegemonic position, not just in the Gulf, but across the region, has given Israel and the Sunni Arab states a strong common interest based on a common perception of threat. And I want to emphasize that because when we think about India's engagement in the region, it's important that Indian policymakers understand that that's what's driving this Abraham Accords axis. Because India, as Professor Pant can explain to us, and I hope he will, he referred to it, but India seeks to have a balanced relationship between Iran and the Gulf Arab states and Israel. And there's a tension there. There's also a tension there between China, which seeks a balanced relationship between Iran and, say, Saudi Arabia. What's driving the Abraham Accords axis, I said, is a concern about Iran's destabilizing behavior and its threat to the order that the Sunni Arab states, Israel, and the United States are trying to maintain. So, from the American point of view, we now have a basis, a platform for doing more in the region while we do less, paradoxically. That is to say, we can move from being the dominant player that stabilized the region for the last 4 decades, 5 decades, to playing a supportive role for our partners in the region who are working together. And if you think about the Gulf states, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar in particular, across to Egypt, Jordan, across to Morocco, with Israel in between. That axis not only has a kind of geographic scope, somewhat like an arc of stability to counter the arc of instability that Iran has been promoting in the region, but it provides a way for the United States to engage in a more supportive role. And I think that's what's happening. And we will see next month in June, I expect, a visit by President Biden, who is on his way now to Asia for an ASEAN summit, a visit by President Biden to the Gulf. He'll go to Israel first, I think, and then to the Gulf, where there will be a GCC meeting with Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq, probably, and bringing Iraq into the fold of the Abraham Accords axis, something that's not usually thought about, but is certainly being worked on by Egypt and Jordan in particular. And that will be, if it happens, it will be a manifestation of this new formula for stabilizing the region. I think that there are a lot of dimensions we can get into. It's going to require the United States and Saudi Arabia to overcome their significant differences. And I think if President Biden does go to Saudi Arabia, that would be an important first step in that regard. It will be important to deal with the tension between America's focus on organizing democratic countries, including Israel and India, of course, against the autocracies. But how we deal with our autocratic allies in the Arab world, that model doesn't work. And so there's a tension in that dimension as well. But I think that what we are witnessing now is a fairly dramatic change in the way that the United States is dealing with the Middle East that is just emerging. But it is what I would call a pivot plus, or which means, yes, a focus on a rise in China in Asia, and of course Russia's aggression in Ukraine, but also not instead of, but also a return to an important supportive role for our allies and partners in the region, of which the Abraham Accords becomes the critical platform.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I wonder if our two earlier panelists have any responses to what Dr. Indik had to say, because I found some of what you said rather interesting. I don't see, I see the pivot away. I don't see a loss of interest in the Middle East for the United States, but I see a recalibration in many ways of what they are trying to do, because they have many other priorities as well. And I think that the threats ebb and wane, this is how it works, in a geopolitical world. But I really wonder what Ambassador Rotem and Professor Harsh think about some of what Dr. Indik has said.
Well, Michelle, I say the following. I think that many of the points of Dr. Indik, I think, are valid and based on his extensive experience about the region. I think that to that extent, we the countries in the region that sense that there are something different in the way I remember America engagement 10 or 20 or 30 years ago when I was still in the system. So it takes some time for all of us to understand this process and also to adjustment into this new, I would say, architecture. To what extent America is involved in the region. So, with this respect, Henry Kissinger, that Dr. Indik knows pretty well, always used to say that if you don't come to the Middle East is going to come to visit you. So you cannot actually leave the Middle East without some degree of management or engagement, because as Dr. Indik said, bad things can happen if you're not going to be there. Now, if I can add one layer into this perception of supportive role that America would like to provide in the region, is that America needs also from time to time to use its own allies in the region to ask them to be more proactive, to bring about the American interest and the American importance in the way other countries think in this region. I think we can play a role with this, convincing or discussing or engaging countries in the Gulf to believe that America's role remains critical, even if we disagree on some issues between us and America. Iran is the main story, of course, because look, it was always interesting. When President Trump decided to withdraw from JCPOA in 2018, it was interesting to see who was against that. England was against, Germany was against, France was against, but the countries in the region were actually mostly pleased with that. So the countries in the region developed more sense about what is actually the actual threat to us in terms of stability, in terms of survival, in terms of other issues at stake. So even if we have tension, if America might have some tension with some allies and friends in the region, some of the allies of America can play a role now to facilitate more understanding about American position on certain issues. And I think this is a new element of Abraham Accords that was not there, let's say, 4, 5, 10 years ago. Now, we can play to some extent behind the scene a role in keeping this interest of America in the region. As I say, without this engagement, without this kind of management, bad things can happen.
Thank you. I think that's quite interesting. Dr. Indik, I don't know if you want to respond to that, or if Professor Harsh has something that he'd like to say.
Yes, very briefly, and I think it would be useful to hear Dr. Indik on this as well. India's relations with America are today perhaps at their highest they have ever been. And that also allows for India to think of a role which is much more robust and much more, lack of balancing, as we were discussing earlier. But one of the problems has always been that there is always uh, I don't think the intent which Dr. Indik clearly articulates has been articulated by the US in such a manner. Because you do see this back and forth. You have Mr. Trump coming in, JCPO is gone. You have Mr. Biden coming in, JCPO is revived. You hear talks of pressure being put on Saudi. I mean, a lot of the discussions that Saudis are having with the Iranians, and so there is a sense that if the regional states themselves are trying to look at the Iranian question in a different manner, then for an external actor like India, which is largely supportive of US interests in the region, what do you do? And I think the quadrilateral dialogue perhaps allows one platform where you can discuss some of these issues, in a much more rational and open manner, and countries which are like-minded in the region perhaps can discuss, what does the Iranian question look like for the region and for America. But I think for a country that is not really a resident state, it's trying to come from outside, largely supportive of the US. I think a lot of the times that clarity, that intent is not clearly articulated, and so I think it will have implications for India's own balancing role, India's own attempt to carve out its relationship with Iran. As I said, if you look at the numbers, if you look at the data, India does not really have much of a relationship with Iran. Trade numbers, economic numbers, diaspora, nothing, there's no energy there. But there are issues which are specific to the region, like Afghanistan, which played a very important role at one point in time, between India and Iran. And there still is a great synergy there because of the Taliban being present in Afghanistan today. So I think, those issues become, for India, for a country like India, to deal with Iran on a regular basis. So, I would be very interested to hear Dr. Indik's views on this as to for other actors who are not the residents but are largely supportive of American role in the region. How do you then structure a security architecture which imparts some clarity to this very interesting role that Dr. Indik has articulated for the US going forward, and for the regional states, of course?
I think that we have to have an element of tension management in this architecture. It's like building these large buildings. I live in New York, where we have these massive buildings now that reach the sky, and they have built into them management for when the wind blows. They're able actually to move. And that's the model that I think we need to have India as playing an important role. And I think it is an important role in this overall architecture. There has to be some allowance for the tension. Geography dictates, as Professor Pandit said, an Indian approach to the region, which has to take account of Iran. Because, as he said, of considerations that are local to Asia, South Asia, that the rest of the groupings that we've been talking about, Gulf Arab states, Israel, the United States, don't have that same focus or concern. And so I think, that the architecture has to take account of that. On the other hand, the question of American reliability in this structure is critically important, and I'll be the first to admit it. We have underway at the moment, as a result of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, a major shift in the global balance of power. And I don't know whether my fellow panelists will agree with this, but I see it as a major shift in the global balance of power. in America's favor. Russia has done great damage to its standing as a superpower, particularly its standing in the Middle East, where it has been making inroads as a result of America's pivot away from the region. And now that Russia has revealed that it cannot defeat even a small neighbor on its borders, it raises real questions about its power and its efficacy. And I think that India, the Gulf Arab states, and Israel have all been slow to recognize what's happening here. And all have been, in a sense, hedging, trying not to alienate Russia, walking between the raindrops. It's quite noticeable that all of them are adopting the same approach. And yet, I think, and Ambassador Rotem and Professor Pant can comment on this, I'm sure, but my sense is that they're all recognizing the reality that I just described, which is emerging out of the war in Ukraine. And that will impact this overall effort to build a security architecture on the Abraham Accords, a recognition on the one hand that the United States is a critical player in the region, and therefore the hedging policies that have been adopted in large part as a result of our own unreliable behavior now need to be adjusted and in favor of the United States and away from Russia and China, I should say. That's what the Europeans have done quite quickly and dramatically. But they have the same question as they turn back to the United States. And the question is, can we rely on you? And I say that because I recognize that it is a fair question. I cannot look at you today and tell you that Donald Trump will not be president of the United States in some 2.5 years. I hope and pray that's not the case, but I can't assure America's allies and partners and those who are trying to make their strategic calculations that is going to happen or not. So part of the challenge here is not only to manage the tensions, but to manage the uncertainty of an America that certainly intends to play this role as things stand. And there's bipartisan support for our engagement in countering Russia and its aggressive ambitions in Ukraine. But will the deep division in American politics manifest itself again in American foreign policy 2 years from now? I can't reassure you on that count. It's possible. And I think we have to proceed on the assumption of what serves the strategic interests of all of us, all of these countries, at the same time as recognizing that we can't be sure of what policy the United States will advance in 2024 and beyond.
That's true. This actually gives me an opportunity now to introduce the question. This comes from my former colleague, Lawrence Anderson, who used to be Singapore's ambassador in Saudi Arabia. And it's rather long, so let me read this out. And then, because I think it ties in nicely to what you've been talking about as well, Dr. Injay. What Lawrence asks is that while the US is no longer relying on oil and gas from the Gulf, surely it cannot afford to have those states and their oil and gas supplies fall to Russia, Iran, or other hostile entities. You talked about the war in Ukraine. Lawrence asks about this as well. It says the war in Ukraine and the desire of the Europeans to look to alternative suppliers of oil and natural gas would have only emphasized this fact. Would the panel agree that all this only reinforces the need for the US to play a major role in the Middle East? I open it to all three. I suppose it would be, I'd like to hear actually from Ambassador Rotem and Dr. Inde as well, what they think of this.
So shall I go first?
Yeah.
Just quickly, I think, look, this is critically important, as the questioner suggests. And the United States has been engaged in a rather difficult relationship with Saudi Arabia. The President Biden, referred to Saudi Arabia as a pariah state, and decided to keep Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in the penalty box, or put him in the penalty box for his involvement in the murder of Adnan Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist, and this has really had a fairly profound impact on the relationship, to the point where the Crown Prince is refusing to receive the American Secretary of Defense, refusing to take a phone call from the President of the United States, and most important of all, refusing to pump more oil to reduce the pressure on prices that has come from Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And that is feeding inflation in the United States and across the world. That's damaging the Democratic Party's prospects in the midterms that are coming up at the end of this year. And so as a consequence, now President Biden is engaged in a shifting of focus. And say if he goes to Saudi Arabia at the end of June, as is now being prepared, that will in effect signal that the Crown Prince has been taken out of the penalty box. And in return, one hopes that Saudi Arabia will start to pump more oil and reduce the pressure on prices. And that will be a critical part of the kind of process that I've been describing of essentially building the Abraham Accords axis as a platform. And the question then will become, if we sort out our relationship with Saudi Arabia, will part of that package deal, if you like, include Saudi steps of normalization towards Israel? And I think that's something we should watch for as well. But the first part of that will be a recognition that Saudi Arabia's excess capacity for oil production is going to be critical to American interests for the foreseeable future. And that's a real change in perception that has happened as a result of the war in Ukraine.
Thank you. Ambassador?
I think that Dr. Indik is provide a very comprehensive answer to that, but I would just want to add that, listen, I was not trained as my diplomatic cadet in Israel to defend Saudi Arabia here, but this was not my role. But I have to say that from the way we see that, to some extent, some of this tension is not just about the attitudes toward the Crown Prince. It's also about the fact that certain critical Saudi's interests were undermined by the war in Yemen, including attacks by drones from Yemen or by missiles that supplied by Iran into Saudi Arabia and even to the Emirates. And there was no American, to some extent, sense of understanding this concern. So I think that we come back again to the issue of Iran and the role, and so it's a complex of issues here. that the question that Dr. Indy stated before, that how much we can rely on America umbrella of security in moment of need. And I think that, well, hopefully by June, when this is going to be happening by the visit of the President Biden into Saudi Arabia, I think this element is going to be touched also by those countries who are undermined by the activities of the Iranian in the region. I don't know if it's going to be in a formal way or informal way, but definitely is going to be part of the discussion. And of course, from the Israeli perspective, any role that America can play to go beyond this existing 4 countries in Abraham Accords will be very significant. To see Secretary Blinken in Israel in the Negev summit last month, bringing together 5 foreign ministers of Arab countries into Israel, Michelle, we have never been in this scenario before. I mean, you know, my first boss in the ministry was Shimon Peres. That was his dream comes true, in a way. But I have to say that we are new in this position. We have never been part of a coalition around us. We were always, actually, sometimes even enjoying that we say that we isolated. There is no one that we can reach out to. It was broken in 1979 with the peace with Egypt, and then with Jordan. But we have never seen a model of peace like that we so much welcome in those capitals, in a way that even I, when in my previous capacity, when I did it before, visits all those areas before the formal agreement, we felt very welcome, very much liked. Michelle, we don't get a sense what it means to be liked or to be appreciated in the region. We need to understand what it means to us, and also to develop the nuance for us, because we now also risking, if we do not behave in a certain way, we also risking to some extent some of those benefits that we already gained in the last year and a half. So I think that to some extent, Abraham Accord plays also, to some extent, also providing Israel a different framework upon which we are going to conduct, and to some extent, I don't want to say that collectively, but there's nothing wrong if we are going to have here and there an advice of a mentor. What does it mean to be part of a region? That we have allies in a region. That was never been our experience before. Only about a year and a half ago, we were the first time we were basically invited to a regional forum. It was the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum in Egypt. Wow, first time in 40 years of peace that we were, that's what I mean, that even those, if we do some mistakes here and there, we need to some extent also someone to give us a good advice, a good direction, what it means to us too, being finally accepted and welcome in the region. And I think this role can play by good Americans, even maybe former Americans who have this experience, to direct us into the right way, the right path forwards.
Thank you. Actually, listening to you talk about this, I also wanted to think about something else. You know, we keep talking about all these big geopolitical changes. We talk about all the different sort of economic changes within the Gulf states, etc. And you're looking at very different sort of governments and states. You know, some have royal families, others are democracies. One thing that we've not talked about, and I really want to come back to this because we also got a question from Ong Keng Yong, who is the executive chairman of the Rajaratnam School. He's also my former boss, and he has served in Saudi Arabia. He has also served as our ambassador to Iran. And he actually had this question about Saudi Arabia, which I thought was quite interesting, and I wanted to address it to you, actually, Ambassador Rotem, because we talk about all this at the top level, but what's happening at the ground? One of the things Minister Shanmugam said in his address was he talked about changes that are occurring away from the austere and orthodox Islamic practices in Saudi Arabia. And I think one of the questions that I have thought about, and actually Ambassador Ong has brought up, is, are these changes sustainable? Because you can talk about all these big geopolitical changes, you can talk about all these different issues and about, the changing dynamic, what the Abraham Accord has brought, and it has brought you all into the fold. But what does the ground feel? Do you know what I mean? And do you think it's possible that there will be these changes, and that the changes are here to stay, that they will be sustainable, because you can make the suggestions from the top and bring it down, but whether the ground accepts it and then it filters and percolates is another story.
Well, Michelle, I think there is a risk. There is a risk of every country that try to introduce significant change in its DNA, in its code of behavior, socially, economically. It did happen in many other places as well. So when the crown princes basically try moving forward in certain areas, he's definitely taking upon himself a risk. He said, in the end of the day, he's a young man. And for the first time, if I can do some kind of analogy, we were asking him to go from the back seat of the car into the front seat of the car and ask him to drive the car. So when you first time you drive a car, you always have an adult sitting next to you for the first few months when you got the license. The question is, who is going to be the adult next to him? Because sometimes, as we all understood that, he basically did some, what they call overspeeding, and make some mistakes. But the question is, are we in position to understand that this is basically some mistakes of the beginning? Some of them are really difficult to accept. But yet, does he is the hope of the future for the region? From our perspective, Israel, we have seen some degree of openness that we haven't seen before. So when you see this element of the gender dimension, the element of disengaging to some extent from the Wahhabi school of Islam, this is significant step forwards. The very notion that without some green light by the Saudis for the Emiratis and the Bahrainis to have the deal with Israel, likely we wouldn't see that too. So I think that he's living and he's trying to move it into some new dimension in new areas. And we all have a role to play, directly or indirectly, to make sure that he's managed all those changes in a reasonable way that will take the kingdom into much better position. 5-10 years ago, we always used to criticize Saudi Arabia for not introducing reforms. So now we're criticizing them from time to time that they're introducing reform, maybe too fast, maybe too slow. I think that to some extent, to see Saudi Arabia driving the car for the first time, maybe for many years before, it's a very important development. We just need to make sure that the right person will be next to him while he's driving the car.
Thank you. There are quite a lot of questions, but I think what I'm going to do is that I'm going to just focus on two questions that I actually find rather interesting. One is for Professor Han. The other one is actually for Ambassador Rotem. Maybe I'll ask you first, Ambassador. Early on, when you were talking and you spoke on the panel, you talked about reaching out to Asia and others. the question that has come up is, what is the possibility that partnerships with the Muslim majority countries of this region will materialize?
If there is hope, it should be Indonesia. I think Malaysia, to some extent, for Israel, at this moment, seem to be hopeless. They have always been with a very strong anti-Jewish sentiments. I think that you all know that this is maybe the only country in the world that when they issue a passport, the passport is valid to all countries but Israel. This is Malaysia. And it's strange to see that when we talking and engaging with Arabs and with Palestinians, with Muslim countries, Malaysia seems to still being a very much out of step with the changes. Indonesia is a different story. If there is a hope for people like me, is to see Indonesia being more engaged and more involved. This is not just the biggest country of all. We have never asked Indonesia, I think, to play a little bit bigger role in this peace reconciliation process between us and Arabs, and us and the Palestinians. I don't know to what extent they have a desire to be engaged in this process, but I think that we need to knock on the door and asking this question to them and providing some role to play. Because if they are going to come on board and providing, it can start with kind of statements of support. It can come with some kind of a small activities. I can say this from my own experience. There have been non-engagement already with Indonesia. It's never actually matured into a real process. If that's going to happen, I think it's going to ease other countries in the region either to recalibrate or reconsider their point of view with respect to Israel. To some extent, if I can say that, under my term, under my time in the ministry, when I was the Director General for 4 years, it was two eyes policy. One eye for India was the second eye for Indonesia. India, to some extent, was an amazing success story for us. And I think there is more room even to expand this relationship into a more strategic dimension on all fronts. And I think the Prime Minister Modi has been very courageous to pursue these kinds of policy. And he was the first ever Prime Minister of India to come to Israel in July 2017. So that was a real success story. Indonesia, there have been some engagement. Some of them have been through the UN facility, but I think there's more room to do. And I think that sometime we might need to take the initiative with other countries in the region, because they can play a very significant role by toning down there, because this is representation to some extent of a moderate Islam that we all would like to embrace.
Wow, that what you talked about could be another hour-long or 2-hour-long panel discussion, and I unfortunately just don't have that time. I'm so regretful about that, because there's been so many interesting topics that have come up, or answers that have come up in the course of this panel. I'm now going to do just one last question, because I'm getting pinged and told that we're running out of time. I want to turn this question now to Professor Pant. You talked earlier on, you talked about the US and India as being like-minded. And the one thing we've not talked about, which is the so-called dragon in the room, no one has really talked that much about China, And so the question I have for you is, how much of your India's push in the Middle East is also related to China's push within the Middle East? Is there some kind of impact? Surely there must be. And how do you see this also playing out within the Middle East? I mean, quite clearly, nobody wants the Middle East to become the source of tension for relationships among one another. Everybody treads carefully because it is such a complex region in any case. But to what extent is China a motivating factor for India?
Thanks, Michelle. I think, China factor, of course, is everywhere in Indian foreign policy. Even as we speak, Indian soldiers and Chinese soldiers are almost eyeball to eyeball along the border. So there is a, I think, especially since the violence along the border with China in 2020, it will be 2 years next month. There has been some dramatic recalibration, including, major expansion of the Quad agenda in the Indo-Pacific and other areas. And I think India-US relations have benefited from that strategic convergence. And that has been, the structural reality for India. I think in the Middle East, the process started much earlier in some ways because I think a number of the Middle Eastern countries, especially the energy suppliers, were looking at China and India as two potential, customers. And so the outreach is, if you look at the Saudis, you look at UAE, it started around 2005, 2006. That was the first time the Saudi king visited Asia in a major way. It was a major, a sort of a visit to India. And then I think the signals were coming that, that there is, with all the debate that was happening in the US about America's future role, especially the America getting bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan, what was the future of American engagement in the Middle East? I think that was a time when a number of regional countries reached out to India and also to China. And I think in some ways for India, because of the China factor, it became also an imperative to enhance its strategic ties in the region. And as Ambassador Rojan was saying, it has been a dramatic journey. If a number of since 2014, the kind of diplomatic investment that India has made on its what it calls look west policy, which is the Arab Gulf states and Israel, it has produced remarkable dividends for India. I think one of the biggest success stories when historians would look back at Mr. Modi's term as Prime Minister would be that a paradox. Hindu nationalist prime minister making great inroads in the Middle East with the Islamic countries. And the relationship has been so tight that a number of these countries like UAE and Saudis have actually, to a certain extent, been turning their backs to Pakistan, which used to be the traditional partner for many of these countries in South Asia. So I think that the change of tone, the change of temperament, the change of relation, the dynamic in the relationship has been quite remarkable. Some of that has come because the regional countries wanted to diversify. Some of that has come because India wanted to establish itself as an important player in the region, partly to juxtapose its role with China. Of course, India can't, doesn't have the capabilities to match what China has offered or is offering to the region. But I think India has, perhaps a greater cultural understanding of the region. And India's engagement of, at multiple levels where there are strong people-to-people ties with the region also is a very important dynamic in this relationship. So I think both with Israel and with the Arab Gulf states, it has been a very remarkable journey. And that has been partly about China, but only partly. The other stuff has been about India's own engagement with the region and regional states' efforts to reach out to India as well.
Thank you. Wow, this has been an interesting panel. I'm very glad that I had the opportunity. It's really been my honor to actually moderate for all three of you. I want to thank you all very much. I have a few conclusions. One, the Abraham Accords clearly has opened a whole new world, which we really have no idea where it's going to go, where it's headed. I would say perhaps there's some hope for some cautious optimism. The great fear about the United States, I think, I don't feel that it's leaving, but I do feel that it has started to pivot away. I think I share many of Dr. Indik's views that there's a recalibration, but there's also a recognition that it is not as straightforward as they had originally thought it would be, they had anticipated that it would be. I think the US will continue to be something of a presence in the Middle East. I think it necessarily has to. But I think that the countries in the Middle East itself, particularly the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states, countries like Israel, also recognize that maybe, they too must play some kind of a role. How this pans out, where it heads, the direction it takes to, remains to be seen. I think we have many more questions than we have answers. And I think perhaps this is the way it's going to be because, it is such a new phenomenon. I mean, I think every one of us was caught off guard by the Abraham Accords. I really never expected it to be manifested so publicly. We knew that the relationships existed. We just never thought it would happen so obviously. Everyone looks at China, but and while the US has articulated that China is a big problem for them, at the same time, they've never said that they're not interested in the Middle East. There are priorities, and you have to pick your priorities, and they shift based on variables, often unpredictable situations, unexpected developments such as Russia and Ukraine. I mean, no one really saw that one coming, and it has had an impact and continues to have some kind of impact across the globe. So I want to thank you all very much for your time. I want to thank everyone who has participated in our conference, has joined us, has actually contributed questions. I'm sorry, I apologize if I missed out many questions, which I think I did. But, I think all in, we had a really wonderful discussion, and this was really a marvelous way for us to close our conference. And so I want to thank all our speakers and panelists, and I look forward to seeing everyone again. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.